Professor Karen Dubinsky is in Global Development Studies and History at Queen's University. She started visiting Cuba in 1978 and has lived in Havana intermittently since 2004. She is a leading scholar of tourism. She brought out The Second Greatest Disappointment, Honeymooning and Tourism at Niagara Falls in 1999, and has written extensively on tourism in other contexts. And one book I'd really like to mention is Cuba Beyond the Beach, Stories of Life in Havana, BTL 2016. Here's an unparalleled look at Havana, and it really blends Professor Dubinsky's gift for empathy and hard-headed realism, if I may say so, Karen. It's just a sensationally good book about
Thank you.
what every visitor from Havana must sort of wonder is that, especially those of us who are deeply sympathetic to the revolution, we see so many sites in Havana that correspond to what we're hoping to see, and so many sites that say, oh my goodness, it's just such a, well, you have this wonderful phrase, a beautiful wounded city. So welcome to Syndemic, Professor Dubinsky.
Thank you.
So my first question, before we get to the situation of tourism in Cuba specifically, can you share with us some of the recent insights from your two recent trips to Havana in late 2021 and in spring 2022? How are Cubans responding to COVID-19 and the country's seemingly permanent economic crisis? Do you think that the hunger strikes in old Havana and the explosive protests of July 2021 are going to make a lasting difference?
Well, thank you for the opportunity to talk. Cuba is one of my favorite topics, so I'm happy to be here. My two recent trips were both in many ways quite different. I was there in 2001 in December when a little tiny travel window opened up, to my surprise, maybe to everybody's surprise, and I took advantage of that window to just go in December for a short time, just a week. Because I've spent lots of time there, I have lots of friends there. So obviously my first interest was in seeing my friends who have lived the pandemic in a way that has been very different than the way at least people like me in Canada lived the pandemic. So I wanted to see my friends. I also wanted to meet some of the new people with whom I was hoping we would be working at the University of Havana, people who are our colleagues and collaborators in this course that I've been co-teaching at Queen's for 12 years. And of course, that had been put on hold. So there were some new personnel at the university. If we were able to continue the course in 2022, I wanted to try to meet them. So that's also why I went in December. And in fact, we were able to host the course again, to my surprise, to lots of people's surprise. So that's why I went in May, just this past May, last month. I went with a group of students from Queen's, and we did what we used to usually do in May, and that is spend 2 weeks at the University of Havana receiving presentations from university professors, from academics, as well as journalists and musicians, artists, other kinds of scholars, as well as doing some site visits to places like art galleries and music venues, things like that. So that in brief, that's my two most recent trips. December, I went with my partner in December. We were among the first and frankly the only foreigners in Havana at that time. I mean, I don't say it, obviously I said that impressionistically. I don't have statistics to back that up, but there were very few. Things had really just reopened. And to the extent that Cuba had, quote unquote, reopened at all, it had reopened in the beach areas. So there weren't a lot of people in the city. It was, I kept thinking about this funny, crazy Leonard Cohen poem from 1961. I think it was like The Last Tourist or The Only Tourist in Havana. Leonard Cohen had the genius to show up just before the Bay of Pigs invasion, and so wrote typically Leonard Cohen-ish. Very funny, but also very deep and ironic poem. My experience was nothing like being at the prelude to an invasion, but it certainly did have a similar sense of, whoa, the streets are empty, the streets are dark. It's not just that there weren't a lot of foreigners around, there weren't a lot of Cubans around. People were just like the rest of the world, I suppose, just kind of opening their doors, literally and metaphorically, to see what this allegedly post or leaving COVID world was going to look like. I go to Cuba to see my friends, and I also go to listen, because as somebody who teaches about Cuba, sometimes writes about Cuba, I feel like when I'm there, I have a responsibility to listen. And when I'm here, I listen and read as much as I can through social media, but that's not the same as being in the same room with people and getting to ask people questions. So I did a lot of listening when I was with my friends. I heard a lot of sadness about how difficult the past 2 years had been. The best thing I will say, and this should be upfront and underlined, the fact that this small, blockaded country, poor country in the global South, was able to come up with its own vaccine without Pfizer attached to it, without any of the big pharma attached to it, was able to come up with its own vaccine, and then managed to get 90% now, I think, of its population vaccinated in this, in the same short period of time the rest of the world has. That's the best thing. That is an amazing achievement. That's an extraordinary achievement. They didn't have the needles to put the vaccine into people's arms, but they had the stuff itself, right? And that's so when I say people were suffering, of course, COVID hit, and there were some very bad periods. I don't want to say it was all a walk in the park. But when I say people were suffering far less directly from COVID. Almost everybody I knew actually had it, or knew people who had it. But by the time the vaccine got really well in circulation, it became more like, here, you get it, but if you've been vaccinated properly, it's not the worst thing. It's not fatal. Which is not to say there weren't fatalities. There were plenty. But that's the. I will say this kind of ironically. That's the end of the good news. It has had amazing success, keeping its people alive during this pandemic in a part of the world where, in the part of the globe that famously, notoriously, the inequalities around vaccine distribution between first and third world have made things so much more difficult in most of the global South, and Cuba just did not experience that. So that's a remarkable achievement.
It really puts me in mind of a great quotation from your book. And I think you were unsure whether this was apocryphal or real, but the CIA agent who is taken to task by his superiors for not drafting his report, and he offers this excuse for the report. He says, "I will never understand this country. There's no food in the shops, but everyone is well fed. There's occasionally chicken in the markets, but there are never any eggs. Clothes in stores are horrible, but people are beautifully dressed. They never finish any construction project, but no one is living on the street. Everyone complains about the revolution, but everyone loves Fidel. That's why I can't write a report about this country."
I've forgotten that.
That sense of contradiction. A country that's able to develop its own.
Now, I gotta say, I heard that from friends when I was there in the early 2000s, when I started going there as a researcher, not as a tourist, but I had been there as a tourist plenty of times before that. So that's a joke that was told to me in the early 2000s, and it was an old joke then.
Right.
It's really an old joke now. In fact, it's not funny. Now things are too sad, right?
Way too close
Yeah,
to the bone. Uh,
yeah.
yeah, you mentioned how the contradiction of a Cuba that can develop its own vaccine
Yeah,
and really keep its population safer than many populations in the world.
absolutely. Yeah,
And
yeah,
yet you have to wait 5 or 6 hours in
yeah,
a long, long line
yeah,
just to get a chicken.
yeah. A Cuban economist whose work I admire, he put it very succinctly. Why could we develop this sophisticated vaccine in the middle of this huge global catastrophe, and yet we can't keep chicken or pork on the table? And that, that's good rhetoric. It's a good question, and it's not a question that can be answered quite as succinctly,
Right.
but it's definitely a question that has to be asked.
I mean, can you help us understand this contradiction?
Well, I mean, I could run down the kinds of things that Cuban economists say, that has to do, especially in this moment, right? That has to do with, and here's things I would just, draw from my own experience the last couple times I've been there, a continuing huge emphasis and investment in things like hotel construction, when as somebody I read on the internet or on social media somewhere yesterday, for these invisible tourists, because there's no, I mean, I can't say there's no one there. Of course, there's the resorts. I don't know what capacity they're at. They're not full by any means, but there are tourists in the resorts. In Havana, there's very few visitors, and these, the hotel construction I'm seeing is in the city of Havana. Why this emphasis on hotel construction when buildings are literally falling down in a strong rain? That just happened last week, 2 weeks ago. Hurricane type, not hurricanes, but the rain, the kind of force of rain that one associates with hurricane season, and 50-60 buildings in Havana alone tumbled. The infrastructure is in such bad shape. Why spend all this? The tourism, obviously tourism is a necessary economic strategy. I'm not questioning the entire strategy, but a lot of Cubans are questioning why the investment in new buildings. That would be one set of questions. People use the words like, economists use words like disaster to describe agriculture, and especially the agricultural sector. It's never been, it's always been a problem. I'll tell these stories through jokes. What are another old Cuban joke? What are the three successes of the Cuban Revolution? Education, healthcare, and culture. What are the three failures? Breakfast, lunch, and dinner. That's been an old Cuban joke, again, for decades. I can't even remember where I first heard that. I think it's associated with this. I think it's actually associated with the 60s era. I mean, I guess if I was gonna focus on one thing, I would focus on the obsessive quality of state control over. I mean, we're talking about the economic problems, clearly, over the economy, but that kind of level of obsession, state obsession, is reproduced continually in the arts and in culture and in writing and in media, which are the sectors that I pay more attention to. And that's what is actually, for me, I don't want to say the most alarming, because, lining up for chicken 5 hours a day or 5 hours, or whatever, is pretty alarming. But the restrictions on expression and the incredibly hard-hearted, ham-fisted reactions to, for example, the protests of July 11th last year, which continues. Those things most definitely continue. That That's not the Cuban Revolution that many people outside, I mean, obviously I'm speaking obviously as a foreigner, that's not the Cuban Revolution that people thought they had signed up for, in a sense, right? That thought that they had admired, or at least many of the achievements that had been admired.
It's almost as though the pandemic has given authoritarian rulers an opportunity to clamp
Exactly.
down in ways
Yeah.
that, yeah.
Yeah. The way, it's funny, the way a lot of critics, and critics in Cuba, when they're in Cuba, when they're writing from Cuba, they have to be very careful in how they broach their criticism and how they express themselves. So I've seen this turn of phrase that people use, which is something like this revolution, this government that that feels it has a connection with the revolution, that thinks of itself as an inheritor of the revolution. In other words, this, like, even linguistically speaking, asking serious questions, distancing these guys who are currently in power from this thing that happened 60 plus years ago, as opposed to what these guys who are in power would call themselves, the revolutionary government. They don't take 5 sentences and subordinate clauses to get there. But even people who are, and when I say people, I mean, the people I'm reading online, scholars, journalists, people who talk for a living, people who comment for a living, are raising questions in as direct a way as it's possible. And I don't mean the artists and the musicians who are raising questions the way that artists do, symbolically, metaphorically. I mean the people who are like law professors and people like that.
How about ordinary people? Do you get the feeling that the regime is?
Well, yeah, that's another question. I mean, okay, let me give you a very recent example. Just this week, a young woman who goes by, her first name is Amelia, so everybody knows her as Amelia. She is I would guess, like 30-something, white, educated, mother of 3 who received her gas bill. She's not getting regular gas. There's what they call apagones, blackouts, regular blackouts everywhere. She lives in a relatively poor working class neighborhood in Havana. She's educated. She works in tourism, which means she's got, a little bit more money than many people. She just had it up to here with paying a gas bill, and the gas price, all the utility prices have gone up. She's had it up to here. She goes on to, she sits there with her phone and she opens her Facebook or whatever it was originally posted on, and she just like yells into the camera for a good 8 minutes in high Cuban, and I had to watch it 3 times because she's speaking so quickly and so colloquially, but you didn't have to grasp every word to get the emotion of it. And she's yelling at her government, and she's yelling at her government as an equal, like, I'm the citizen, you're the government, it's your da 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 da. It goes instantly viral, maybe surprisingly, maybe not so. She's not the same kind of person, demographically speaking. She's not exactly the same kind of person who was on the streets on July 11th. She's not young, she's white, she's, and she kept emphasizing her, that she's a mother, right? She's a mother of 3 children. So that kind of kicking it up a notch in a certain sense in terms of the expression of, I think, a similar kind of rage and frustration. She was not screaming about liberty. She was not down with the dictatorship the way lots of people on the streets were. But when people get angry, it's difficult. And maybe is the most relevant question to ask, are you angry because your gas bill went up? Are you angry because you had to line up for too much for chicken? Are you angry because you think this government is not doing its job. Like there can be, those are, and how do you separate all of those things? So she was expressing something, excuse me, she was expressing something on the one hand, very specific, my gas bill, and I can't use, I can't cook anyway because we've turned the power off. But on the other hand, she wasn't yelling at her neighbor who works in the office of the gas company. She was yelling right to the very top. And so I think that's all by way of saying, does the average person, the person on the street, the Cuban mother with 3 kids, or the Cuban kid, the Black Cuban kid who lives in the neighborhoods that came out so strongly in the protest, those are, in some ways, those are different demographics, and they are different from the artists and musicians who have been gathering also at more or less at the same time, having hunger strikes, gathering outside the Ministry of Culture, which is a pretty unprecedented thing as well. There's a lot cooking, there's a lot going on. It's not the same people. It's not the same people saying the same things, but it seems to me significant that this is all happening at the same time, right?
Yeah. I wanted to ask now a little bit more about tourism. And I mean, I've been to Havana and loved it. I always wondered a bit, though, whether I was any better than other tourists. I sort of fancy myself as a sensitive, empathetic, intellectually curious person. And yet, wasn't I just being another gringo from the far north as I sort of interacted with them? Or I hoped I was being more genuine. And it's a hard one to navigate. And your book does that so beautifully in terms of talking about this, just the nuances of the touristic encounter. Has Cuba as a destination altered Canadian perceptions of the global South?
Yeah.
I also wonder whether about Cubans' perceptions of Canadians. I mean, we've been at this relationship now for well over 5 decades, and Canada is one of Cuba's primary places to recruit tourists. Has Canada's relationship with Cuba been mutually beneficial, or has it just paralleled many other exploitive colonial relationships?
Yeah. No, those are really good questions. I'm working on a project writing ultimately a book on the history of at least Canada-Cuba relations, at least in the cultural realm, right? And I've also done some work on Canada-Cuba relations in the development realm, looking at early development aid projects. CUSO had a big project in Cuba in the early 70s. Canada was, a Canadian NGO, was the first NGO to be invited into the country after the 1959 revolution. That says something, again, to what you were saying about this relationship that is distinct, or how distinct is it? So I've interviewed lots of Cubans certainly in the development world who were involved in that project, but also people in the culture world, musicians, especially, both there and here. And I go there a lot. I know lots of people. The stereotype, of course, is that there's this huge affection. It's funny, a Cuban friend in Ottawa, I just heard her say this recently. I'd never heard it put like this. She said, yeah, Canadians adore Cuba. I don't know if it's because of Pierre Trudeau or because of Sunwing vacations, but they, and maybe it's both, right? Maybe it's both. But that question of Cuban perceptions, it's easy to talk about Canadian perceptions of Cuba, easy for me as a Canadian, maybe easier to get at that, to try to reverse the gaze and think about what it looks like from the other side. That's also something I've asked people. And I sometimes actually, after interviews, I have a kind of a stock question, which is basically the sort of what you were asking. So is there, there's this talk of this special affinity between Canadians and Cubans. Do you think that's true or not? Some people, there's a range of responses. Some people just kind of roll their eyes and say, look, Cubans are astute, Cubans, and I don't mean that in the crassest sense of that, but like Cubans know that it's used to be, I don't know what, I mean, the figures are obviously lower now, but I think the last pre-pandemic year, 1.5, 1.3 Canadians visited Cuba annually that year. Canada was the highest tourist sending nation in those years. So, you know, you don't have to be a genius to think about how that influences the relationship. Are Canadians nice? Are they nicer tourists? I don't think so. I mean, what? I mean, if that, you know, that stereotype of Canadian, I'm generalizing, obviously, that stereotype of Canadian niceness, maybe what that is actually speaking to is the history, that there are plenty of Canadians, as you were describing yourself, who, I mean, not all Canadians would go necessarily with the same sense of the history and the same kinds of political questions as Professor Ian Mackay would go with. But Canadians go, I think, with the sense that there isn't a blockade, that Canada acts differently vis-a-vis Cuba than does the US. And that actually, I think Canadians, and again, this is, excuse me, this is anecdotal, I think a lot of Canadians go back to the same hotel year after year. So the reason that I know what I think I know, or am able to learn about Cuba, is that I just go back. I go back a lot, and we bring students every year, and I try to go back for the film festival. So it's like any kind of relationship. Once you show yourself to be a known quantity, a trusted quantity, someone who listens, someone who's not there to tell you what to do, but someone who listens. I mean, I think if Canadians have a good reputation in tourism, it's for that reason.
Your book does talk about some Cubans who prefer German tourists to Canadians, because at least the Germans are kind of interested in the culture. And it turns out the Canadians just want to lie on the beach and sip their mojitos.
And I guess the other thing that helps that relationship along, I was going to say that Cubans are, I mean, it may be frustrating. One assumes it would be frustrating to be thought of as a beach, nothing more, right? And people who work in tourism are extremely well educated. So they know that, you know, they know that there's a lot more to the place than would you like another mojito. On the other hand, there's a knowledge about Canada that exists in Cuba, in part because of that relationship, in part because of increasing migration. So, I mean, the first question that almost any Canadian gets asked when you step into a Cuban taxi is, what's the weather like? You know, if it's January, oh, it must be cold, right? It's a cliche, but it's a cliche that's based on a kind of a knowledge. Yeah, my cousin is in Montreal. My brother lives outside Toronto. There's a lot, not obviously nowhere near like it is in the US or even in Spain for that matter, but that closeness, that proximity in the people to people sense, I think is also meaningful.
So maybe it really adds a new dimension to what tourism scholars sometimes, you know, we often get into this kind of binary, we're against it,
yes,
for it. The literature on tourism like fundamentally split between those who want to critique it,
exactly,
and those who want to develop it.
There's
lots of gray in between that, isn't there? And you're suggesting that there's a lot of, over these decades, relationships have evolved between tourists and the tourist on. More complicated than that.
I think, I mean, what could move things in a more, there's many things that could move things in a more equal direction. One of them is for Canada to take a really careful, critical look at its own policies around granting Cubans visas. You know, Canadians get their Cuban visa on the airplane as they're passing out the peanuts. It's not an application process. It's just a paper. Oh, don't lose the, what is this? People probably don't even realize what it is. It's the same thing that Cubans have to go line up for, pay for, and very often get denied because Canada doesn't believe that people from the global South can be visitors. Everybody is treated, at least initially, the suspicion is, posible emigrante. You're not coming to Canada to visit your friend, the Canadian professor, with whom you've had a long friendship with. No, you're coming because you want to clean floors in Canada. And so if those relations could be more equal, if there were more opportunities for actual exchange, I think. And I've lost my other point. It'll come back.
It bears on a fourth question I had, which was kind of the vision of Cuban tourism. And it's always, as someone who sympathizes with the revolution, it always struck me as quite paradoxical. Fidel's notion that these would be like factories generating revenues for a regime that really wants to raise the living standards of the rural masses. And the way to do that is to basically attract zillions of tourists to these resorts, which are not that easy to distinguish from resorts anywhere else in the world. I mean, they're basically very hierarchical. They're run on a very capitalist basis. You get the feeling that there are people who earn reasonable salaries and people who are just getting by.
Yeah.
And I also, when I talked to people in Cuba, they were, those who weren't in the sector really resented it because the salaries are so much better. I imagine the pandemic has changed some of that equation.
Yeah.
I wonder if overall Fidel was wrong, that in thinking that you could isolate the cultural and social consequences of tourism as a kind of little offshore bubble that really won't generate too many contradictions in your own society. Well, it struck me that there were lots of social tensions being aroused by the tourism industry, especially, as you pointed out, one that's so obsessively followed by this government, right? Like even when the economy seems to be falling apart, they're erecting new hotels. That's just a real preoccupation.
Yeah, I mean, Cuba was dragged, in a certain sense, kicking and screaming into mass tourism, or tourism as it's understood, let's even just say in the region, right? Caribbean tourism. Cuba chose to do that during the quote unquote special period when the Soviet Union collapsed. So it wasn't, it was by no means their first economic development strategy. In fact, the research I've been doing on let's say the first generation of Canadian development workers who went to Cuba to help build an engineering school. They weren't tourists. They were teachers. They were NGO, what we would now call maybe NGO workers. You could barely get to Cuba in those days. There weren't direct flights. You had to go through Mexico. It took hours, if not a day, maybe. I think you might even had to stay overnight. The hotels were the things that had been kind of sitting in mothballs basically since the revolution, right? That tourism was not by any means their first choice of a development strategy, an economic development strategy for really good reasons. It sucks as an economic development strategy generally. Economically, it's not, so much of the money goes back to the first world in terms of multinational hotels, etc. So yes, they definitely tried to organize something economically different with more joint partnerships, not foreign ownership, the way most of the rest of the Caribbean is organized. What does it do socially and culturally? That's another really big question. And again, I like the way you pointed out that there are very binary kinds of answers among tourism scholars, which I don't think are super helpful. I remembered my other point actually, which was related to this, in terms of how to think about a tourism that could be less hierarchical. It's clearly hierarchical economically. Socially, Cuba's different because the guy who's mixing your mojito could well be way more educated than you are. And he's mixing your mojito because it pays him more than it does to be an engineer or to be a medical doctor or to be a technician. That's not a great development strategy either. But when in the 12 or 13 years that I've been working, at Queen's, bringing students to Cuba, to Havana for this course, sometimes at my most maybe cynical, I think what are we like, what are we doing? What is the take home message? What is this accomplishing for them? Of course, there's a million things. And I'm not actually feeling particularly cynical right now. I'm actually, having just come back, I'm really, I love watching the way students can assimilate such a different place and so many new experiences in a pretty sophisticated way. But sometimes I think basically what we're doing is creating more educated tourists. And sometimes that seems like not enough. And then other times I think, well, what's wrong? What's wrong with that, right? And maybe that's, you know, that begs a whole lot of big structural kinds of questions. But more educated tourists is not a bad thing in and of itself.
Do you get the feeling that Cuba might change its tourism strategy, given you were mentioning the resistance that you're noticing about people, you know,
Yeah.
hotel construction?
Well,
You think there
I
might be a
mean,
mass shift away?
yeah,
And I was thinking about your story about the guy mixing my mojitos who has a PhD, and
yeah, yeah,
surely
yeah,
he, at some level, must really resent
yeah,
Canadians who just want to get drunk on mojitos. And
yeah, yeah.
it's like,
Well, the most hopeful the most hopeful moment that I've seen since I've been going there has been when Raul Castro took over, and there was a big emphasis on um, thinking about private entrepreneurship, small business.
yeah,
Maybe the state is not the only engine of economic growth. None of this had anything to do with a change in political dynamics, in structures of government. This was only about the economy, but there was a kind of a renaissance of certainly in the arts and cultural world and in the small business world, little design shops, that kind of stuff. And that was, I think, I mean, in some ways, I think that's my answer to your question. You can have people visit you and have the money spread around and have them spread around more equitably. Not everybody has to stay in a big resort. Not everybody wants to stay in a big resort on the beach. In terms of the students that we get for our course, so many of them take our course because they, like so many Canadians, they were Veradero tourists with their parents when they were younger. They came into the city for a 3-hour bus tour and they went, whoa, this place looks cool. And so that's, that I think there's a way of, I don't want to say democratizing tourism, that sounds kind of absurd, but of Cubans maybe getting a little piece of things through renting out a room in their house, through getting involved in Airbnb type projects, which was actually happening until Trump took over, the pandemic took over, and everything just collapsed. So when people are saying, why the hell are we building these new hotels? That's an anti-tourism question, but I don't think it's necessarily an anti-visitor question. Why are they building those hotels when my neighbor has an Airbnb that's been empty for 2 years? That's how I'm reading in part that question.
My last question is, Karen, you and I have both worked on tourism for a long time, and I noticed that people think it's quite a funny topic. And if you go to an academic setting, you often, they'll find out you're studying tourism, and they'll think basically that's a good old segue to tell you all their funny tourism stories,
right.
Like Boston Airport or whatever.
Yeah.
So there's a kind of sense it's kind of almost a silly topic, not worthy of our attention. What might, by many estimates, is now the largest industry in the world.
Yeah,
so there's quite a contradiction built right in this dismissal of tourism, yet it is such an enormous thing. So I was thinking that if we were looking at, in a sort of sick way, at happy stories coming out of the pandemic, well, one of the happy stories, in heavy quotation marks, will be that tourism is no longer such a laughingstock, because tourism has actually been shown to be this kind of immensely efficient way of spreading a virus. in many ways, mass tourism organized on a
Huh.
capitalist level is almost like a very dangerous weapon aimed at humanity, and that
Hmm.
it allows a virus that emerges in Wuhan to spread
Yeah.
around the world in a space of a month. The virus can't swim.
Yeah.
It was
Yeah.
primarily tourists who were. So this is like the first, basically, global disaster brought to you by mass tourism. I think that might well change how academics look at tourism. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I hadn't thought of it that way, but yeah, there's not, I mean, where I thought you were going, which is also a disaster, is look, I mean, everybody knows that, academics, tourism scholars certainly point out that tourism is risky business in terms of sustainability. In terms of sustainability, and I don't only mean that environmentally speaking, although obviously that's a big thing as well. Tourism can be faddish. Tourism is not global capitalist-based tourism does not produce local small business type wealth the way it produces chain hotel wealth, all of those kind of things. But even having said that, when it's gone, it's gone. And if one's economy is so heavily based on tourism, then it's just gone, right? So that's that kind of, eerie, dark stillness that I saw in Havana in December, and actually in May as well. That shows you how important visitors are, in whatever form, right? That shows you how important visitors are to the lifeblood of an economy, to the vibrancy of a city, all of that kind of stuff. But you're also right that carries that has baggage, not just in terms of economic relations, but also in terms of what gets carried, right? Yeah. I guess I mean, I don't know. I when I started working on tourism, it wasn't just tourism, it was like honeymooning tourism. People thought that was like really, really weird. But I don't know if people, I mean, I'd be interested in knowing what your experience is. I don't know that people laugh at it in the same way as maybe they did 20 years ago, even pre-COVID. And what is maybe another thing that's going on is I think at least people in the global north who are really used to getting on airplanes at the drop of a hat for work, for pleasure, for whatever, all of a sudden 2 years of being told that you can't do that, that also changes how people are thinking about it. I mean, it certainly increases the critiques that this is environmentally ridiculous and globally catastrophic, and so it certainly gives more fuel for that argument, which isn't wrong. I wouldn't say either.
But we're caught in this dilemma. I keep thinking, Luc Renaud, who does scholarship on cruise ships and their destructive impact, was visited us, and he pointed out that locations in the global south don't really have the privilege of saying to a cruise ship, we want you to abide by these rules.
Yeah,
because that cruise ship will just go to the next Caribbean.
Exactly.
So in many ways, we have a radically stratified industry where throughout the global south, people are far less able to say, as they're saying in Barcelona and Venice and Amsterdam, they're saying, enough of tourism. We really want to limit this.
Yeah.
I fear that after the pandemic, it'll be just a race to the bottom to say, okay, among destinations, we've got to have you back. We'll almost pay you to come here. And the situation just be aggravated.
And that actually speaks to something we were talking about earlier as well. I mean, people who go to Barcelona because they want to see Barcelona and they know something of its history and they know it has good art or good food or good culture or good whatever. People are encouraged, and I'm not saying tourists are sheep, because I don't think they are, but in this part of the world, it had always really annoyed me when I see places advertised as sun destinations, as though Trinidad and Jamaica and Cuba and Belize are all the same. They are sun destinations. And so that would kind of help, I suppose, the argument for educated tourists, the argument that these are all different countries that have different histories and different art galleries and different food traditions, and all the things that one looks for perhaps when you're leaving your own reality and entering into another, that it might be wise to spend a little time thinking about that and not just thinking about sun destination.
Yeah, you write really well in your book, Canadian Tourists Fantasizing that these are our mojitos, these are our waiters, these are our beaches. And that it's just the classic colonial attitude.
Yeah.
Do you think that's waning? I mean, with all the new sensitivity about racism and all the new, the post-colonial, I mean, are we starting to have people who say, this is really racist and patriot?
Yeah. Well, I mean, sure, that critique has obviously always been there. I had a student write to me this year in a first year Intro to Development Studies class that I actually used to teach for a very long time. I don't teach it anymore. I don't know how she found me because Cuba. So she wrote me and said, I don't know if you can help me. My parents are taking an all-inclusive vacation in Cuba this spring, and they want me to go, but I've just learned all about how horrible the world is in my global development studies class. And I have learned that tourism is a bad economic development strategy, blah, blah, blah. I know exactly what she learned because I know that curriculum, and maybe I just shouldn't go. And I thought, number one, I thought, not for the first time, I love teaching first year students because of the honesty and the guilelessness with the, like, what can we do about this? But I think, even though that is in many ways, obviously naive and it's more complicated than that, and not going is not any better a solution than going. If people were asking those questions, maybe minus the guilt, but if people were asking those questions, if more people were asking those questions, I think that would be really useful. And then maybe do something about the condition of the world so that there could be more actual exchange. I mean, right? There's no reason to think that Cubans aren't just as interested in wandering around our streets, taking pictures of our curious markets and our curious foodways, all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I guess one last question, last comment would be, like, it goes to this point about how, the happy story of the pandemic with regard to tourism. And what I've been thinking is that people like us would never have entertained, except as an academic possibility, that this mega machine could ever be shut down. There's just too much in it, right? Too many people who have their livelihoods attached to it, too many corporations, it's just way too big. And since, over the last 40 years, it's just grown bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. But COVID-19 did largely shut this mega machine down. And I noticed among the tourism scholars, there's just a new sense of, okay, now that we've shown that it can be shut down with huge human costs and huge suffering to people who depend on this sector. Nonetheless, it was shut down. What do we do afterwards? And there was like this moment of possibility. We can actually, it's not that we can think of, actually, it's not just thinking outside the box is actually kind of collapsed. We're saying, oh my God, this is where we've been for the last 4 decades. Can we do this differently? So I just got the sense in the early pandemic, of a new sense of possibility. I'm not getting that sense anymore. I'm
Yeah,
getting a sense
yeah,
of a more kind of,
yeah,
let's just get through this and get
yeah,
back
exactly,
to normal
exactly.
and
Yeah,
reopen the
yeah,
hotels and get the, how do you
yeah.
feel? Is this,
No, I mean, what you're saying has parallels, echoes, reverberations on all aspects of life. Sure, tourism, but also social welfare, social equality. I have to say, I didn't share as much as others did. I didn't share the notion that we were going to be able to build a new Jerusalem out of the pandemic,
right,
because I don't think, well, for a million reasons. Maybe I'm getting old and more, I don't know, cynical, disappointed, jaded, call it what you will. But also, I don't think, in general, I don't think social change comes as easily from desperation as it does from optimism and feeling like you actually matter, like you and your neighbors and your community
yeah,
actually matter. And I saw a lot of that in terms of the neighborhood level, and in terms of things like, which is actually interestingly maybe also related to this tourism question. I think if we want to talk about the lasting impact of the pandemic, of quarantine, periods of quarantine, people were way more, I think, aware of and interested in supporting local, being worried about their local, their restaurant, and who is, that's a Wendy's. Well, yeah, but the one next to Wendy's is a Greasy Spoon that's been owned by the same family. So, the way in which people became, I think, way more conscious about supporting local initiatives, whether business or otherwise. That would be cool if that stuck around. What does that mean in terms of? Does that mean not necessarily that people are not going to continue to have curiosity about other places, because I think curiosity about other places is a fine thing, not a necessity, but it's a fine thing. But does that mean that people are maybe going to be more willing to think about not patronizing a Holiday Inn, but finding an Airbnb? Like, you know what I mean? Is that, and maybe even not an Airbnb, but something that is even more local than that. If that's a consequence, that might be good. It's obviously about reform, but I think that's where we are if we're lucky.
yeah, that's sort of the middle ground I think we need to pursue in tourism studies, is not an apocalyptic sense that we'll just get rid of it altogether, because I don't think that is feasible,
Yeah,
and not the booster sense that this has got anything really, any potential for
yeah,
poorer countries.
yeah,
Because I can't think of one instance where people use this, apart from Cuba,
yeah,
as a coherent development strategy, right? Where
yeah,
the Cuban model was really, we're going to try and recoup many of the revenues as we can in Cuba.
yeah,
And,
yeah.
and even
But again, don't forget that was born of desperation. That did not emerge fully formed in 1959.
right,
What they did in 1959 was the revolutionaries themselves took over the hotels. You've seen those famous images of them smashing the casinos, and these wonderful images in the Hotel Havana Libre, right in downtown Havana, of these guys sitting around the hotel lobby with their guns, slung over their shoulder, and their boots on the coffee table, desecrating, in a certain sense, these former Yankee-owned hotspots. So that's sort of that same, what you're talking about, the kind of anti-tourism made flesh. Like we're taking this over, and because of all the stuff that it represents. So I think there was a little bit of gloss maybe that was applied in the 90s when things reopened. But what I'm reminded of, this horrible quote from Fidel Castro, who said, apropos of the same opening, He said, yeah, well, with tourism brings all the social ills that we've tried to combat, but at least our prostitutes are well educated. That is as cynical a response as I think it's possible to have. It's awful, it's ugly, but it says something about what that moment meant, I think.
It's definitely one of the most troubling elements of Havana, isn't it? I mean,
Yeah,
my partner and I, same-sex couple,
yeah,
I wouldn't think we were very good candidates for prostitutes in Havana. I think we were solicited like 5 times.
yeah, yeah,
One
yeah,
walk downtown. It's like,
yeah, yeah,
this
yeah,
is it's
yeah,
very
yeah,
troubling.
yeah,
And
yeah,
you
yeah,
feel for the people who are in that predicament.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
So maybe Fidel's bet has, we're still not sure. The jury's
Yeah.
still out on whether this bet was even
Yeah,
wise one.
yeah, yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Karen.
Oh, this was fun.